Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this legal compliance session run by Kaizen Synergy Law Firm. My name is Nihal Samara. I'm the General Counsel and Legal Director here at Kaizen Synergy Law Firm, and I'd like to welcome you all to today's session. Today's session focuses on the roadmaps that different state governments have been rolling out in the last week or so. We will be having a follow-up session next week, which will build on the works that we are actually talking about today. That said, we're going to step through some of the really specific legal compliance obligations that your agency needs to be aware about. We're going to provide some case studies of what other agencies have done, particularly in the not-for-profit and community services space, and actually have a look at what is working around this to try and make it easier to meet your legal compliance obligations, especially as these roadmaps get rolled out. And if they do need to be retracted for lockdown measures, then how do you respond to that as well too? I will add, by attending this webinar, just to put it into a little bit of context to start off with, this is going to be a general information session. We are not going to engage in some of the news headlines of what we've seen with anti-vax protests or whether this is legal, but rather how your agency can respond to current laws. What is your current laws and legal compliance obligations from a not-for-profit community service agency that you all are attending from, and really looking at, well, how can you respond to these requirements and what does this mean for you as well too? That said, we have been running these webinars since February 2020 last year, almost weekly, and onboarded some 4,000 agencies, particularly looking at giving agencies like yourselves a better understanding of what the current COVID rules are, improving your awareness of the rules and how and what these are and how they work, as well as really giving yourselves a timely set of resources that your agency can use. And we will be sending out copies of these slides along with the recording and also any other resources that we do refer to today as well too. We will look at some case examples of what has actually been working within the community services sector and what people have actually seen around this as well, and some of the challenges that they have also sought to address. A few housekeeping items before we start as well too. As I mentioned, this webinar is being recorded. It is actually being recorded all the way up to the question and answer part of the session. You can ask questions in our chat group. I am supported by Ruby and Lynette from our support desk today as well too. And we will get to all questions as we go through it. We have also switched off people's microphones at this stage, but you should be able to adjust the volume on your computer and or other mobile device by simply using your volume controller at your end as well too. As I mentioned, all materials referred to, including these slides, will be circulated out today as well too after today's webinar. And also, if you do have any questions, you can directly reach out to us as well too. My mobile number has been made available publicly since February as well. It's attached to all the emails as well. So if you do have any questions, you can utilize that as well too. Or if you want to reach out directly to our support desk, you can do that on our 1300 number as well too. We have just got a couple of questions coming through, and I will raise these as we go through today's session. Also, just from Veronica, just asking, what should our insurance coverage be like to cover us from claims that a visitor or contractor, etc., contacted COVID whilst in our workplace? That's a really good question, Veronica. We're going to look at how to and what systems, policies, etc., you should be putting in place if you haven't already, in terms of trying to mitigate those insurance challenges as well too, and also work health and safety challenges that agencies are seeing. So we're going to cover that off this week and also unpack it a bit further at next week's webinar as well too. But certainly, if you do have other questions around these, please put them into the chat group, because we will absolutely get to all of these as we go through today's session. So just to provide some context around this of the works that our law firm has done, this is not advertising, this is just to put it into context of what our skills are around doing works, especially in the COVID compliance space. Essentially, our law firm works for community service organisations right across the country while we are based in Victoria. And thank you, Angela, for just asking that question. I was just about to cover it off. Angela's just asked, I notice you are in Victoria. Is what you cover relevant to New South Wales as well too? Yes, Angela, it is. We'll also be covering Queensland, WA as well too. I'll be providing some of the summary roadmaps for each of the states shortly as well too. That said, yes, our law firm is based in Victoria. However, we do provide services right across the country in all states and territories of Australia as well too, and also overseas as well. Some of the works that we have done covers off even New South Wales when they've recently had their lockdown and the easing of restrictions. But essentially for community service organisations, we have worked with them of setting up everything from testing services to vaccination clinics, legal agreements, covering off contractors coming into agencies, health promotion and compliance plans, media releases, risk management, aged care, NDIS supporting agencies across the states as well too, and territories, as well as different dashboards and forms that agencies need to look at. So in this space, it is very much from week to week. Laws and regulations do change for agency, and there is a lot of confusion around what are some of the requirements that community service organisations, irrespective of where you're actually based, what are the requirements that your agency should be looking at in terms of meeting these requirements. That said, we've also covered off things like staffing requirements, volunteer checks and details, as well as contractors and also members too. You will find that a lot of our webinars are also publicly available in the past as well too, that we have run. And you can view these on our website or even directly off our YouTube channel as well too. And essentially pretty much every topic that we've covered off since February last year is also listed on the on our YouTube, which we have actually made available to agencies as well. Andrew has just asked, will all volunteers need to be vaccinated? Also, the government are allowing 20 unvaccinated to attend a worship service out of a total of 150 people. If a vaccinated person or a staff member gets COVID from an unvaccinated attendee, are we liable? Look, yes, Andrew, we're coming to that question as well too. And where you do ask these questions, I will also recirculate the answers that we're discussing today and also look at what you need to do. But we are going to cover off the workplace challenges that agencies have. So let me just jump in and look at the current context of what we're going to be covering off today and what is the backdrop of what legal landmines we're going to walk through. So essentially, there is just a lot of unknown information out there, and the purpose of this webinar is to unpack what we are seeing unravel across the different states and territories. Essentially, when you look at whether it be in Victoria or New South Wales, there is now the push by governments to actually start to issue mandatory vaccination positions, in some cases for teachers, childcare workers, parents of childcare workers, hospitality workers, and hospitality patrons. There's the requirements looking at also the problems that a lot of the religious groups are looking at in terms of this raising of a vaccine passport. community service organisations right across the country have approached us in saying, how on earth are we going to actually, are we expected to actually screen every single client or consumer if we even run a tea shop or coffee shop as part of our service as well too? How on earth do we actually ask, or can we even ask to for people to display or show us their vaccine passport or proof that they've had a jab before entering our service or receiving a service as well? That said, there's also lockdown measures that the government are rolling out from time to time. We're seeing that in different parts of the country as well too, and agencies are looking at really clarification on what you are required to do, as well as what you do to make these things a lot easier, both for your agency staff, volunteers that you might have working for you as well too, and also ensuring that you're providing safe services to your clients or also consumers as well too. So today's session, we are going to look at the roadmaps. We're going to look at the workplace laws as they currently stand. I do acknowledge that we have lifted information from different regulators as well too, and I will outline those as well too, particularly where there's rules from Fair Work, human rights commissioners as well too. We'll discuss some of the legal compliance obligations because it does cut across public health directives. It cuts across work health and safety. It cuts across Fair Work. It cuts across human rights requirements. It cuts across privacy laws. So we're going to try and unpack these for you as we go through as well too. And certainly focusing on the roadmaps, we're going to look at the workplace laws and some of the tools that agencies just like yourselves have implemented and we can see are working. And when I say working, essentially it has been involving staff, volunteers, and we are focusing specifically in the community services space and not-for-profit space. And what we're going to also look at is how they have done some of these things as well too, but keeping in mind that what I'm talking about here is evolving as well too. So while they are putting in systems and compliance systems in place to help them do this as well too, there is this ongoing engagement of ensuring that as the roadmap milestones are reached, or alternatively in cases where focused lockdowns are coming in, then essentially they are rolling things back, but essentially able to manage their staffing requirements as well too. Noel has just asked, considering the Privacy Act provides protection for people against discrimination due to their sexuality, ethnicity, religious beliefs, disabilities, and health issues, etc., how can an employer even ask about people's vaccination status? These are great questions, Noel. We're actually going to cover that in the session around this and unpack that for you as well too. As I said, we've actually pulled different regulators' information together into this session to cover off some of the Fair Work requirements for you as well too. That said, we'll also give you access, for those of you that don't have it around this, to the resource that a lot of agencies are using, which is our GEMBA 360 compliance dashboard as well too. You'll find that you can actually use this to assist you with your compliance obligations as well. With it, there are a lot of forms and tools that you also will have access to, and also template documents as well. So covering off some of Noel's questions and Angela's questions around admin requirements and also vaccine checks and checklists on who can actually ask information, and even down to things like cleaning registers, working from home forms and daily assessment forms and all kinds of things that we'll actually talk about as we unpack some of the legal obligations that you need to look at. But you'll all get access to this, to the demo dashboard around this, and you can actually get some of these resources at hand as well. Just to summarize, and I'll start by this just to give you a point of where we're heading, and then we're going to circulate back to this. Essentially, what our recommendations are going to be coming out of today's session, and I always like to do this in our webinars, is rather than wait till right at the end to give you this straight up around this, is to say, focus on your COVIDSafe workplace policies. I'll actually show you what those are. So this is not a webinar where we're sort of going to give you sort of the structure and by the end of it, you're even more confused than what you started with. We're going to unpack these and actually give you sort of a checklist type of approach of what to actually do. We're also going to look at discussing a position on a vaccination policy. I know that a lot of questions have already come up around whether you should have it, whether you shouldn't have it, whether you can ask for it. We're going to unpack that today as well too. And also from a work health and safety point of view, we have put in consider HR and vaccination registers for staff and also volunteers. I'll talk to you about that as well too and show you what other agencies are looking at doing. I know this will create a lot of questions that agencies will have around these, but I will show you how they're actually doing it and the reason why a lot of volunteers and staff that they have are actually voluntarily working with agencies that they are employed by or provide volunteer support to in order to do this as well. Leading into next week, we are going to be looking at things like the passport vaccinations. We're going to be looking at managing staff, volunteers, and clients and consumers as well too, and the operational side of the works that we're talking about today as well. So that's looking ahead to next week. As I've mentioned, there are a lot of questions that I assume will come out of today, and also I hope that this will clarify it for a position for you as well too. But of course, if you do have any questions, by all means reach out to us. My mobile number is listed here. We are working with agencies right around the country around this as well too, and our support desk is also here to support agencies exactly like yourselves on this as well. So let's move forwards. As always, we'd like to pay our respects to the elders past and present upon the lands on which we all meet. While this session is being run by webinar and recorded, we do pay our respects to the traditional owners accordingly. So essentially, let's start this by looking at where we are heading and what are some of the compliance obligations that you have. This was essentially taken as we're looking forward to the discussion around passport vaccinations, vaccination passports and checks. When we look at whether it be the Victorian Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission, or whether we look at the Human Rights Commissioner in New South Wales or other states as well too, essentially the general rules are still applying here. Essentially where there are directives coming out from basically Commonwealth and state government organisations. What we are saying to a lot of agencies is look at what your specific HR compliance obligations are, because essentially waiting for directives from Commonwealth or state governments may actually leave you well behind where you actually need to be considered as well too. Essentially, when you look at whether you're based in South Australia and also New South Wales or the likes, essentially where a lot of things are coming out is that people are arguing around the masks and vaccinations. And essentially what we are seeing is that discrimination laws in this space essentially provide protection for people that have a disability, are pregnant, or have a medical condition. So essentially, on one hand, the governments are providing directions to agencies saying, look, yes, it's mandatory for masks and essentially for vaccinations, where people, they will open up where people have had double vaccinations or single jab vaccinations in some circumstances. But essentially, the human rights commissioners all around the country have said, well, it's not as clear cut as that. And essentially applying a blanket rule to always refuse service to anyone, for example, not wearing a mask, is likely to be unlawful in most circumstances. And the same thing that they've already suggested will actually apply to vaccinations as well too. So essentially, where does that leave you? And we're going to look at that as well. So let's have a look at the different roadmaps that are being rolled out around the country. So, and we are going to look at Victoria, we're going to look at WA, we're going to look at New South Wales and Queensland in the next few slides as well too, and the other states as well. So essentially, when we look at this, they are looking at a 80%, then a 70% dose in terms of what's being required. And then there are specific timelines of what is going to open and when. That said, there are still confusions on, well, how does this actually change workplace rules? And so when we look at these, whether it's based in Victoria around specific metro and regional areas, whether we look at New South Wales and their directives, essentially where it is hitting the 80% double dose mark, the government have indicated that they intend to open up further freedoms around international travel, community sports, and major events in other areas. But what are essentially the workplace rules that you need to look at as well? And the same thing happens when we look at Queensland as well, and essentially the requirements of masks versus the dependent on what is varied between movement and gatherings for indoor premises or funerals or ceremonies. And people are actually asking, well, how does this actually work, even if we look at, for example, WA and what the capacity limits are based on, and this was just updated on the 8th of September, the capacity limits are versus the contact registers, as well as requirements for aged care services, and also for border arrangement between states and where agencies may actually operate across state boundaries, like religious agencies that we support as well too, and community health services, as well as also agencies such as Aboriginal and community health community controlled organisations in terms of their reporting requirements and how they actually manage their services. So essentially what we've looked at is a number of key tools to support agencies in doing this. And what we'll be looking at is the COVID assessment form, workstation form, risk registers, as well as looking at agencies starting to look at HR COVIDSafe vaccination registers and information as to why you would hold this. I will add that this also considers specific when we talk of HR vaccination registers. This also includes why people may not have had the vaccine, or if people are not actually giving you the information as well too. So we're taking a whole of agency approach in actually looking at what information you should be storing. That said, when we look at the different policy perspectives around this, what we are seeing is that lockdowns are to be a way of the Australian way of life, and this was something that we put up from the Australian Doctor magazine back in January this year. And essentially, we started to look at, when we ran these webinars over the course of this year, essentially the rolling lockdowns of what people are actually looking at. Ben has just asked, have you also looked at ACT? Yes, we have, Ben, as well too, and South Australia as well. And with it, we will be covering those as part of the workplace requirements as well too. We will also be sending out all copies of these documents as well too, and other roadmap information after today's session for you to access. You will also have access on your Jemper dashboard specific to the agency where you're based in as well too. So essentially, with lockdown measures being a part of life, and we're seeing this across Australia, agencies are saying, well, if we have a roadmap, the roadmap isn't effectively a one-directional roadmap. Essentially, we could be going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, depending on what the state governments may introduce at one time or another. An example of that is quite simply what we've seen in Victoria, literally not even in the last 24 hours, but in the last 12 hours, after there was a huge protest coming out of the construction industry and new restrictions being placed in overnight around this. So you can see that essentially lockdowns may not be just to a geographic location. It may also be applied to specific sectors across the country by different state governments as well too. So agencies have said, well, where do we in fact go, and how can we in fact manage what we don't know is essentially coming up? So how we've actually focused this on, and I'm going to say we're going to use some case studies around this, is around the HR, workplace laws and vaccination rules. So essentially we've gone back, had a look at the Fair Work reviews around this, what their positions are. We've looked at the Human Rights Commissioner requirements from all around the country as well too, as well as also the Privacy Commissioner as well, and bringing this together in some sort of legal framework for your agency to look at. That said, all the information that I'm talking about here is actually being shared across the community services sector at the moment. So within this, we know, when I say we know this works, essentially we're seeing this across even PHNs or primary health networks. We're seeing this across community health agencies. We're seeing this across disability agencies. And essentially these are the areas that they've actually really focused on. And when we've provided our legal compliance advice around this, has been around these particular areas that agencies have looked at. So essentially employers and employees, and based on the questions that we've even seen just this morning, are seeking clarity on their workplace rights and obligations as COVID-19 vaccines become available in Australia. Now, there are some current laws and public health orders that specifically enable employers to require employees to be vaccinated. And we're seeing this, for example, in aged care services and quarantine hotels. But the Australian government policy is that receiving a vaccination should be voluntary. And so we're seeing this, and where the challenge is on one hand, we're seeing some policy positions and laws saying that it's mandatory in one part, but essentially the Australian government's saying, oh, but it's also voluntary as well. So essentially employers are no doubt confused because we're looking at this going, well, hang on one side we're saying it's mandatory, but on the other hand, we're also saying it's voluntary. And this is the source of confusion around this. So Maureen has just picked up and just said, Maureen's just asked the question, house of worship, what if people don't want to get vaccinated because of religious reasons, or they just don't want to get it? My body, my choice. This is really going to divide the church. How do we deal with this as a church leader? That's a really nice question, Maureen. Let me come back to you because I haven't forgotten also about Angela's question, and also when we go back, Carla's questions around this as well too, around mandatory vaccination. Carla's question around mandatory vaccinations, and also Andrew's questions as well too. So I think we'll address these in the next few slides. But again, you are correct, Maureen. It is going to cause some divisions. We're seeing this as well too. How we can address these to support the clients that you support as well too. We'll actually walk you through this shortly. So essentially, we've got some directions coming out of the different states around this for mandatory vaccination positions. Queensland has issued public directions for health workers. Western Australia has looked at public health directions for quarantine centres. New South Wales has looked at mandatory vaccinations for public health directions under airport and quarantine workers. Now, essentially, when we look at this as well, we are seeing, and let's look at about a mandatory vaccination position for agencies, and what are we looking at with this, and what have we done within this for other groups like yourselves. So essentially, one of the first questions that agencies ask us is, can an employer require an employee to be vaccinated? We're seeing this with companies like Qantas, Virgin have made it very public. Also, companies like SPC, which is a food handling company and distribution company, has also made it mandatory. So essentially, one of the questions that agencies ask us is, well, can we simply have a mandatory vaccination policy within our community service agency. So essentially, there are currently some laws or public health orders in Australia that specifically enable employers to require their employees to be vaccinated against coronavirus. However, there are limited circumstances where this can be applied. Now, there are also relevant factors you should consider whether this is the case. And essentially, if there is a specific law around this, whether there is an enterprise agreement or contract that's in place, and if there isn't any law or agreement or employment contract, whether it would be lawful and reasonable for you as an employer to give employees a direction to be vaccinated. And this, according to Fair Work, is on a case-by-case basis. Now, if we look at the positions, and this is picking up Maureen's question, essentially to look at whether is anti-vaccination views a protected attribute under the Equal Opportunity Act. So essentially what we've seen from different human rights commissioner is that their position is that a religious belief is a fair position. It is a protected characteristic, along with people that are pregnant or for medical reasons. That is a protected reason under the Discrimination Act. So what we've just done, everyone, is obviously jumped from a Fair Work requirement of what Fair Work is saying, and now we're jumping into the human rights legislation. So under Equal Opportunity Act, there is no protected attribute that protects a person from discrimination on the basis of their vaccination status or their opposition to vaccines if it is a political belief or activity around it. So while a political belief or activity is a protected attribute under the Equal Opportunity Act, which makes it unlawful to discriminate against someone's political belief or activity, the protected attribute has actually been interpreted narrowly at this stage. That essentially means that a political belief that you shouldn't have the vaccine may not be considered to be protected under human rights or equal opportunity legislation. And the reason for that, the protected attribute of a political belief or activity is unlikely to apply to a person who is opposed to vaccines being imposed by a private sector employer or service provider. And this is because what the regulator, Human Rights Commissioner, has come back on is that this is because the requirement is being imposed by an organisation like yourselves, if we use an example, that doesn't represent the government, and it would be difficult to argue that the opposition to a private sector's employers or organisation policy is something which bears on the government directly itself. Now, essentially, we have just got a question coming up, and I can't see who it's from, but I was just asked, is it legal to make an unvaccinated workers always wear a mask or have a weekly COVID test when we return to the confined office space? High-risk individuals are at a greater risk of catching COVID from unvaccinated folks. And that's a really good question, because what we're now jumping into is the work health and safety obligations as well. So let me start by just covering off this vaccination policy, and then we're going to go into about mask wearing and work health and safety obligations that you should look at as well. And I'll come to also asking employees to complete forms in terms of the screening, and we'll cover those off as well. So when we look at mandatory vaccination policies, and I'm starting with this because this is sort of the frequently asked questions on whether an agency should have one. Essentially, when we start with this is the checklist that our law firm actually uses to go through whether an agency should have a mandatory vaccination policy in place or what their position should be. And I will add that we've worked through this with some agencies just in the last week alone. And as government directives have changed, they've revisited this and changed their position on it or as well. So essentially, let's have a look at it. So the first one is whether you should look at the Australian Health Protection Principle Committee and identify whether your industry is actually covered by mandatory vaccinations. And what does this look like? So if we look at whether there is the AHPPC has recommended vaccinations for your industry, or whether there is a government directive out there, then essentially this will be a starting point of where your agency is sitting. Now, as part of that, what I will add, and I can see a few questions coming up, is that when we have gone to the AHPPC, and this is where a lot of the CMOs chief medical officers will pull the information from, at times it's not that clear of saying your industry is covered. And an example of that is where the AHPPC has said high mobility sectors such as aviation, mining, and freight sectors pose an increased risk of wide dispersion across long distances of the COVID-19 virus, and essentially particularly to vulnerable populations. But then it figures out and makes a statement, because of the risk of seeding outbreaks across the country, the AHPPC strongly encourages industries to promote and facilitate vaccination. But it doesn't actually give you a stronger position than that, but essentially says the AHPPC strongly encourages the mandatory vaccination policy. So when we go back, at times the AHPPC may not be kind of giving you that clear directive that your agency needs to view. So where does you go from then? So essentially what we then look at is, will your workers, and when we say workers, we include not only paid staff, but also volunteers, be exposed to the risk of infection as part of their work? And so this might be, example, quarantine workers, and also people that are in higher work duties where they will place them in exposed risk areas. Once we do that, essentially we're looking at then people, do your workers work with people who would be vulnerable to severe disease if they were to contract COVID-19? And we can see that now we're starting to pick up information from Safe Work as well too, and covering off your work health and safety guidelines as well. So when people are asking essentially what rules they need to look at, we're cutting across Fair Work, human rights, equal opportunity requirements, and also work health and safety. So the purpose of this mandatory vaccination policy, if I could provide some comment on this, is to look at a work health and safety and what is the likelihood that COVID-19 could spread in your workplace. So picking up the question before, is it legal to make unvaccinated workers always wear a mask or have weekly COVID tests? One of the parts that we start with is, well, what is the likelihood that COVID-19 could spread in your workplace? Is there a government directive around having face masks within the workplace? Is there other medical reasons that they may need to consider? So essentially using this almost question type slide, will give you how you can have a policy position by essentially, and we've seen agencies actually just copy these questions and actually provide a response based on what they're actually sitting with at the moment. It also means, do your workers interact with a large number of people in the course of their work that could contribute to a super spreading event? And again, what are the control measures that are available in your workplace? And I'll show you what the control measures are, picking up Noel's comment as well too. And Christian has just asked, could negative tests be accepted instead of a vaccine passport in some sectors? I think many churches would find it reasonable if these were allowed. Christian, that's a really interesting question. And what we've actually suggested agencies do is start to screen volunteers and workers. This was well before even the vaccine mandatory position, and we did it from a work health and safety point of view as well. So essentially, when you're looking at the mandatory vaccine policy, what we are suggesting is that you focus on those questions around it, and essentially then work out, can you as an employer require an employee to provide evidence that they have been vaccinated? So even if you did have a vaccine policy, what is the position that that you can actually ask people to actually provide evidence that they've been vaccinated? And again, this is where we've actually gone back with Fair Work and looked at what the current Fair Work rules. So essentially, if an employer has provided a lawful and reasonable direction for an employee to be vaccinated, you can actually ask the employee to provide evidence of their vaccination itself. And this is currently under Fair Work rules. So where an employer wants to direct an employee to provide evidence, the employer should make sure that the requirement to provide evidence is also reasonable and lawful and reasonable. And this will depend on a number of circumstances around this as well too. Now, it is unclear whether a direction or the employee's refusal is reasonable if they don't want to actually provide this as well too. And Lillian has just asked, does this include volunteers? Yes, it does, Lillian, as well too. And the reason being, we're looking at this also from a work health and safety point of view. Now, what happens if an employee refuses to be vaccinated? So essentially, if an employee refuses to be vaccinated, and we're seeing this and we're working even not only within the community services sector, we're also working with agencies like hairdressers as well too, to actually work through this with them. Now, I will just jump in here and just raise something that yourselves should actually really consider. First question that we ask people to do is ask, before just talking about standing down employees, before talking about leave without pay and all this, the one question that a lot of employers and employees are missing is actually, and it's actually it's not a legal position, it's actually just asking the question why. If the employee asking the employee why they're actually choosing not to actually do it, or in fact, as Lillian just raised in the question panel, volunteers, why they are not choosing or why they are asking, why they have a position at the moment of not having the vaccine. And it may well be that they've actually got a reasonable position. It might be because they've got a medical condition. It might be because they do fall within the protected characteristics, i.e. that they have a disability, are pregnant, they have it because they're not doing it for religious beliefs as well too. And so with it, what we've said to people is, before you even consider suspending and standing down and all these kinds of legal other issues that come out of it, actually ask the question, why? Now, if they don't have the vaccine after giving clear and repeated lawful directions, then there may well be other fair work positions that you can take. We've worked through, give you a case study around this. We actually had an aged care facility where the person that was wanting to have the vaccine, and they did have a directive that all staff needed to do this. We can see this in residential aged care services before the deadline passed. And the staff member at the time was actually pregnant, and the staff member went to actually get the vaccine, but was actually turned away by a medical practitioner. And so it raised an issue where the staff member actually wanted to get the vaccine. They were protected because they were or still are pregnant as well. It is a current case. And as a result, they had to actually delay, and they actually went and got themselves, saw another medical practitioner, and ended up getting the vaccine as well. So there were times when essentially, and it is almost on a case-by-case basis, that you actually need to look at this. Jimmy has just asked, how does that apply, staff not being vaccinated, when the Vic roadmap says that 80%, that at 80% you can only go back to work in the office if you are fully vaccinated? Yeah, that's right, Jimmy, around that. So essentially, again, where we are seeing it is if they refuse to be vaccinated, it is the overlap between if they have a protected characteristic, if it's a lawful position that they have, for example, under medical grounds as well too. Again, so there will be a bit of flexibility that actually needs to be considered when you're actually going through and actually doing this. And this is where I will say that the governments have placed these obligations square at the foot of employers to, in fact, manage this whole process. And that's why when we're running these webinars to unpack some of these challenges that you're going to face if you're not facing them already, because potentially you can't just turn around and say, everyone in my office has to be vaccinated, because at least one or more people may well be covered by these rules as well too. And there's another question coming out from April, which I will also raise as well too. April's just asked, despite the why around the obligations for under WorkSafe obligations, we would still need to safeguard them and those around them. So we would have to mitigate their presence on work sites with alternative practices, during infections period in our geographic locations, etc. Yes, April, let me come up to that as well too. So that is a great prompt into my next few slides. So if an employee refuses to be vaccinated, can you require evidence about why they've actually refused vaccination? And essentially, if you provided reasonable and lawful direction to be vaccinated, the employer, yourselves, could actually ask the employee to provide evidence of their refusal to be vaccinated as well too. And that might include actually even going so far as actually directing the employee to provide medical evidence or medical reasons for actually refusing the vaccine itself as well. Now, I will add that as part of this process, what we have seen from agencies is the confusion of how do we actually manage this information itself. And I will just jump into, for agencies, especially in the GEMBA dashboard, which you all get access to around this, is essentially, and we've got a lot of agencies joining us for the first time, when you will get your own login today, which will take you to this screen here. You can log in, and it is set up for your own company based on where you are based. So essentially, where we've got people based in ACT, and picking up Ben's question earlier, it will be specifically picked up for yourselves where your organisation is based, and it's something that our agency has worked on. Now, that said, what you will be able to do is go essentially into your HR register and essentially contain and place in information of what you want to see within it as well too. So where we are seeing it, and I'll just come back to this, is when you click on the profiles, we can actually load in information on whether someone has actually had, and I'm just logged in as Fred Flintstone here. You can load in information on the vaccine card as part of your register, or you can actually keep your staffing or volunteer information directly on this to say why they have or why they haven't had it, and actually add that information directly in. So picking up Vanessa's question, do I need to mandate this across it on the vaccination policy? Essentially, the position is if there is a government directive around the roadmaps, which we are seeing, that staff do need to be vaccinated, then that's the initial position that you're starting from here as well too. That said, the control measures or exceptions that apply to this is essentially whether they've got a medical condition or if they've got other protected characteristics. For example, if they are have a disability, are pregnant, or for religious beliefs, then you need to have an option to allow those people that they may not want to have it on those grounds itself. So you need to be clear around it. Equally, you can then ask them for evidence about why they've refused, and essentially this is where we're sitting on this position as well for it, for your agencies as well. Now, picking up April's point around, can an employee refuse to attend the workplace because a co-worker isn't vaccinated against coronavirus? And again, this is going to be dependent on whether your agency is covered under the mandatory vaccination rules. So if you, on one hand, assume that there is no public health order, and this is changing as we're seeing at the moment, it is Fair Work's position is that it is unlikely that an employee could refuse to attend the workplace where a co-worker isn't vaccinated. However, what we are seeing is that, as April points out, vaccination is becoming mandatory in some workplaces now. And so some workplaces won't be able to require their employees to be vaccinated. However, where we are seeing it, and picking up April's point, where there are positions on mandatory vaccinations and on the grounds of religious beliefs, for other protected characteristics, if they're pregnant, or for medical conditions, or if they have a legitimate other reason, then those people can't be discriminated against. And that's the way the current Human Rights Commissioner positions are seeing. Now, the balance around this is, as April has picked up, is around work health and safety obligations as well. So with it, there are times when you can prevent people from entering the workplace for work health and safety obligations, because under work health and safety, you are required to provide a reasonable and safe environment, not only to other staff, but also to clients as well. So picking that up, whether you can take disciplinary action will depend on a person's employment conditions. I will add that we are changing policies across agencies as well. We will see this next week around some of the policies and employment contracts, which we're also going to open up and discuss around these, and looking at enterprise agreements as well too, which your agency may be covered by. Now, Cam has just asked essentially, which I will just jump to as well too, is it reasonable for a vaccinated staff member in a community service organisation to refuse to meet with an unvaccinated client in the client's home, for example, as well too? So let me just repeat that, and because this is where it does overlap with volunteer works and also agency support works, especially in the aged care and NDIS space. So Cam has just asked, is it reasonable for a vaccinated staff member in a community service organisation to meet with an unvaccinated client in the client's home, for example? With that, Cam, our position is that essentially we need to change the policy position for that of agencies. With this, generally our position has been that it's not in this case as well too, because they are providing specific services around this. The vaccinated staff members essentially is what we provide a position within the health and community services space. And you're seeing that a lot, especially in the COVID testing services as well too. And the vaccinated staff member refusal to meet unvaccinated clients, we're seeing that right across the board as well too, Cam, in relation to that question. So that's why pretty strongly we'll form the position that at this time, no, that's not the case as well too. So with it, essentially, when you're taking disciplinary action, and it is important to consider whether the staff members are covered by anti-discrimination laws, which we have covered off, and important that you have a policy position as well too around this. Now, essentially, one of the groups, or the groups that we're actually looking at in terms of where your agency services are, and this includes religious groups, essentially is to look at what are the client groups that you're providing services to. So mandatory vaccination policies and also people that are covered by this should actually cover off, and again, the ATAGI, the Australian Technical Advisory Group on Immunisations, have identified groups of priority populations that are at increased risk to COVID-19. And that does include Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, older people with underlying select medical conditions, and also people in specific occupational groups as well too. So for the last few months, we have actually been taking quite a strong mandatory position around this and working with agencies in speaking with staff to engage them a lot better in this process. Now, one of the things that we have seen come through, and Vanessa has raised this, Paul has raised this, Maureen has raised this as well too, around work health and safety obligations. And April also raised this as well too, just in the questions panel. And this is around what other measures can we actually put in place, and the idea of also things like quick rapid testing as well too, and what can we do to follow staff and make sure that they're supported as well as volunteers. Now, in some states and some states, there is the use of daily attestation forms. And people that have joined us for the first time, I'm just going to cover these off. In some states, departments of health have introduced basically a daily assessment form. We've set these up with agencies. So they ask staff and volunteers before coming into work, before delivering services, to essentially go through a quick questionnaire to ask them if they've got any COVID symptoms. Now, the purpose that some of the departments of health around the country have introduced these is simply to look at a screening of people that are providing services. And the idea is that it is essentially a statutory declaration that people are doing online. And what it essentially looks like around this. And let me just show you what one looks like. I'll just go back one step. Essentially what this looks like is this, and you'll see these under your dashboard. And this is why I'll show you why we've actually run this as a web-based form for you to use. The assessment forms, apart from the QR codes, and if you click on COVID daily assessment form, it'll bring up this form here. Now, depending on which state and territory you're based in, it will come up with the relevant form for you. And we've got the date, the time, and the person, so we can see who's actually filled it in here. And with it, it asks people a series of questions. So, have you been in contact? Have you been in close contact, or any confirmed locations? And if people ask, I'm not sure what the most recent confirmed locations are, we've just got it linked here to Victoria. I'm based in Victoria, obviously. But if you're based in the ACT or New South Wales, it will come up with the New South Wales or Victoria or South Australia or Western Australia link around it. So people can view those. What we've then asked people to do is to essentially go through and answer questions on whether they've got any of the COVID symptoms. Now, this is actually just a really simple form to use. We've had this in some agencies being rolled out since February or March last year. Some agencies, which I will show you, have literally thousands. They might employ 300-400 staff around it. They've got 30,000-40,000 forms because by the time staff do it each day. An idea is that volunteers or staff, before they go out, are essentially doing a quick self-assessment around it. And sometimes they'll put in, for example, if they've got a fever or shortness of breath or sore throat, but also it'll actually identify very quickly who are the people that may have the COVID symptom. And if they're doing it each day, then essentially you've got that point of contact with them as well too. Now, this form has actually been used in agencies that have gone through hotspots, rolling hotspots, multiple hotspots throughout the last, I'm going to say even 15, 16, 18, actually longer, 18 months now. But what it gives them is, because every single person's actually doing it, it is actually available on mobile device as well too, and connects directly back to your dashboard as well. And so you can very quickly go back and see who's actually had any COVID symptoms, and it will flag up for you as well too. And you can actually go back and actually have a look. And we know that a number of departments of health have actually, when they've gone into hotspots, pulled up agencies that have used this form on this system as well, on the GEMA system, and basically very quickly screened literally thousands of people and thousands of contacts and been able to essentially do it. And it means then that even from a rapid point of testing, and look, it's just one of the tools that are there, by actually completing this form each day means that you've got the points, the validated points, and can track people each day around this. And so there are agencies like migrant resource centres, community health services, disability agencies, religious groups, and even places like Creation Ministries International as well too, through the Southern Migrant Resource Centre. So you can see the differences in agencies that are actually using these COVID assessment forms to meet their work health and safety obligations around this as well. So with it, when you look at the attestation registers, it is just one of the most simplest form tools to actually use in terms of meeting your obligations as well. Now, a couple of agencies and case studies that we've been using around this, and I do shout out to Rumballara Aboriginal Cooperative and Laurie Seville, the Chief Operating Officer out there, and Women's Housing Limited, Judy Lyon, the Chief Executive Officer, Lena Tompkinson, the Executive Assistant and Compliance Officer, and also Lindy Parker, the Operations Manager at Women's Housing. Now, essentially what they've got in terms of putting some of this stuff together, and we're going to really look at this next week as well, is when we look at things like vaccine passports and how to manage this, is just there's just so much information out there of what to actually use. So essentially we've got access to your policies document, staff training in the e-learning area. You've got your HR registers and risk tools, which we'll look at next week, as well as the pandemic forms as well. Now, picking up Carla's questions asking, when we provide services to groups of people with disabilities, and we have a number of people with disabilities are vaccinated and wish all people to be in a group to be vaccinated, aren't we infringing on their rights to allow unvaccinated people with disabilities to be in the same group? All staff supporting, let me just repeat this, all staff supporting this, let me see this, all staff supporting this requires support from agencies. So with it, what I would suggest in that case, when we're looking at having groups around this, again, because they're a protected group of people, you may need to change your policy around running group class, and that is something that we are going to look at next week as well too. That said, some of the current policies that you really need to have around this is things like your travel restrictions, work health and safety, working from home policies, and we're really going to start looking at these next week as well too. In terms of women's housing, they've got a lot of their already forms that I've spoken to you about. Things like the COVID daily assessment form, they actually do it when staff are actually working. The working from home approval form, as well as other things like their COVID assessment plan as well, we're going to look at with the roadmaps as well. So with it, what I would suggest you do is jump into your Gemba dashboard. Ruby and Lynette will reach out to all of you today as well too, to essentially, and we're more than happy to make a time and walk you through any questions that you have as well too. Our recommendations coming out of today's session is to look at your workplace policies based on the materials we will send out to you as well too, and also the slides. If you do have any questions, by all means, please contact us directly on the mobile or reach out to us going to our 1300 360 360 number. And next week, we are leading into managing staff, volunteer and clients throughout the roadmaps and actually focusing on only a couple of case studies as well too. If there are any questions, we are going to be opening up the phone lines and also we'll stay on the line to answer any questions that people might have. If you are watching this recording after today's live session, then by all means, and if you do have any questions or want access around the Gemba dashboard, then please reach out to us on 1300 360 360 or email us at support@gemba360.com.